Howdy.
I'm Grey Pilgrim. First of all, excuse me, I've been down ill for the last few days, and my throat is a bit raspy, and my nose won't stop doing that thing. So bear with me. Anyway, these are Egyptian goddesses, actually goddesses, yeah, and well, this story is about Egypt, so I thought I'd throw these out there. This is Isis and Horus, and this is the god Bast, or goddess Bast. She's the patron of the town of Bubastis, and she is from the Thebes pantheon of gods: Osiris, Set, Isis, Horus, Nephthys. Those are the various gods of that pantheon. This is the pantheon, one of the gods of the pantheon of Memphis, and she's of the pantheon of Thebes, lower and upper Egypt. Thebes won, by the way, and basically took over most of the things of the Memphis pantheon. But you don't want to know about that. You want to know about evil Gunses, and I've got some stuff to tell you about them. But anyway, oh, come here, you come over here, come right over here. Okay, not ancient Egypt, but pretty old Egypt, 19th century. Back then, Egypt was owned by the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans had a system where they would put a governor in charge of different provinces that they had taken over. Egypt's governor was a fellow by the name of Muhammad Ali, and he's called the Khedive. That's the name of a governor in Turkish. And anyway, he was a local boy who, the Ottoman Empire was getting a little bit fragile. It was falling apart, basically. And so he was feeling his oats, and he decided to, I'm just going to start building up my local military, my local power base, and see what happens. And he did, and they let him get away with it. So he said, okay, I'll do some more. Well, then I think he died, and his son took over. Yeah, his son took over, and he was also the Khedive. And what he did is he sent some representatives, this was in the 1860s, to the Paris exhibition, which was sort of like a World's Fair that was going on in Paris. Paris at the time was under the control of the Second Empire, under Napoleon III. And Napoleon III, Louis-Philippe Napoleon, was a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, and his bride, Princess Eugenie, and the Dauphin, their son, were in Paris. And this representative went over to the Remington booth at the exhibition, and the Remington was showing off their new, latest, and greatest, which was their rolling block. Now, what's a rolling block? I don't have a rolling block. I wish I did, but I saw some at a gun show last week. But boy, they're expensive. This is sort of like a rolling block. This lever would be here, not down here on a rolling block. And the way it works is you'd cock it, then you'd hit the lever here. I'm going to hit this lever to demonstrate. And when you do, it drops the breech block and basically the firing pin, which goes through it. So you drop the breech block, shove your round in, close it, and then fire. And it's just a very simple system that even a peasant could understand. And the Khedive's people thought, this is exactly what we need. So right then and there, he ordered, 4,000 or 6,000 of them from Remington. Remington was pleased. They got some orders that day. I think the Spanish also bought them. Anyway, so along comes, they all go back. Remington goes back to Ilion, New York, and starts churning a bunch of rolling blocks out on the factory floor there and stacking them up, ready until they get enough for the shipment. Meanwhile, Paris and Berlin get into a bit of a tete-a-tete. There was no Germany yet. It was just the Prussian Empire and the French Empire. And Napoleon III was pissed off at him. That was sort of engineered by Otto von Bismarck over in Berlin. Because he had this cunning plan. Have a war with France and use that as a means of getting all the other little princelings in the old Holy Roman Empire, that's what Germany was, to join in, and then basically band together under the king of Prussia, who became known as the Kaiser. Okay, so you're there with the Kaiser. Well, Napoleon III lost, and his army lost big. They were armed with the chassepot, which was a needle gun. So were the Prussians. They were armed with the Dreyse needle rifle. But they were much better at tactics than these Frenchmen were, and they basically won. Well, France did not capitulate. Napoleon III did, but they didn't. So the government of France devolved to what became known as the Paris Commune. And they sent some reps everywhere in the world saying, the Kaiser just wiped our first army out and took all of our guns. We need to buy guns. What do you have? Well, Francis Bannerman had lots of guns left over from the Civil War, and he sold everything he could. And they said, not good enough, we need more. And they went to Remington, and they were talking to Remington about getting something. And the rep noticed, what were all these guns here? I said, oh, that's for an Egyptian contract. He said, we'll pay you more for them. And they said, ka-ching, sure. And so they worked a deal with the Egyptians, and basically Egypt then defaulted on their order so that Remington could then ship these off to France, which they did, and the Paris Commune ended up losing anyway, but that's another story. But then they started churning out more rolling blocks. Eventually, they would send those off to Egypt. Well, Egypt, because of some connivings back then, they never did make a full payment for it, so Remington sort of lost out in the long run. Anyway, so here's Egypt now armed with rolling blocks, and they've got a fairly good army. Unfortunately, about this time that they had a deal where they sold off interest, 99-year lease, to an area where they're going to dig out the Suez Canal to the British. The British dug out the rest of the canal and got it open and said, okay, Egypt, we need to station some troops here to protect our holdings. And they said, oh, okay, I guess. So England did station some troops, like a whole division there. And by the way, we're going to station some of them in Alexandria, since it's the main port, and we'll station some in Cairo just to make sure there's no incidences. And basically, Egypt became a protectorate of England. Well, because of that, England handed out all kinds of rifles to them in their stockpile. At the time, they were armed with the Lee Medford, so they were getting rid of their Martini Henrys. So they'd also send some Martini Henrys over to the Egyptians. So they had those too. Well, about this time, 1870s, like I said, I've got a cold. My nose is just going crazy. About this time, was Lord Kitchener. Well, there was one Egyptian army that was under the leadership of a English colonel, and he went chasing after this guy down in Sudan. Sudan was owned at that time by Egypt. It was all part of one big country. And the guy he was chasing was the Mahdi, who's said he was the incarnation of Muhammad. And everybody believed him, and religious fanatics. Well, first of all, this general took his 11,000 strong Egyptian army down to kick butt, and ended up losing to a pretty stupid, easy strategy. But anyway, all of his troops were captured, and all of their rifles were then distributed to the Mahdists. So later on, the English intervened directly and sent troops down the Nile to deal with things. By then, Charles Gordon had been sent down to Khartoum to take over as a local governor, and the Mahdists had basically put a siege around Khartoum. And by the time Kitchener and his army got down there, it were 2 days too late, and they found Chinese Gordon's head on a tree. They'd captured him and killed him and beheaded him. Anyway, but they ended up kicking butt on the Mahdists, brought back all those rolling blocks and gave them back to Egypt. And then Egypt says, okay, you can stay here for now, but we really don't like you in our country. Typical thing with the white man's burden and the great game and all of that. Well, anyway, this went on until I think in the 1870s, 1880s, when the Khedive in Cairo decided, enough of this stuff with the Ottomans. He was really mad at the Ottomans, and so were the British. He says, enough. I'm just going to sever connections to them. I'm going to keep the money I've collected for taxes for me, and I'll call myself the king. Hey, Egypt, England, will you recognize us, the Khedive here as a king? No problem. So he became king, and then there's a whole lineage of the rest of them, up until the last one, who was deposed in 1948. That was King Farouk. Now, King Farouk's important. The reason he's important is during World War II, of course, Britain was in Egypt and fighting off Rommel over in the desert. And the Egyptians were still using those rolling blocks and maybe some Martini Henrys and maybe some Lee Medfords by then. But they wanted something a little better. Well, meanwhile, King Farouk has decided to go off to Monte Carlo and try his hand at the gambling at the casino there. So here he is wasting the entire Egyptian economy on gambling. Well, along comes his generals. The generals now were like the grandsons of earlier generals. It was like a lineal thing. And the armies under them had been a little lax. But he had a bunch of colonels to keep control over them, which these guys had been sent off to Sandhurst and other European military academies to learn how to be officers. So when they came back to Egypt, they went, why are we working for these fat old slobs up here who don't know squat? So they got together and had a little coup d'etat and kicked out the generals and kicked out the king and took over. And one of their top numbers was a guy named Gamal Abdel Nasser, and he became the first president of Egypt. And there was three presidents, or three or four, three. I think Hosni Mubarak was the last one. Nasser, Sadat, and then Hosni Mubarak. Nasser decided, well, first of all, Farouk had looked around and said, okay, my army needs some guns. So what he did is he went and bought some guns. And what he bought was this. Ooh, it's a big one. Oh, you get out of there. Ooh, that is an FN-49. A lovely thing, I think, don't you? I'm going to get these out of the way so I don't knock them over and have plaster everywhere. Okay. This was, you can find these early on from the King Farouk era, and then they'll have a cartouche here of a crown, which this one has. Later on, they were marked United Arab Emirate, was it the Union of, I forget what they called it, the Arab state where Egypt and Syria became a country together. And I'll remember what it is in a minute or two, I suppose. But anyway, so it might have their marking up here as well. Well, this one is an earlier one, so this is actually a King Farouk FN-49. Lovely, lovely rifle. Shoots 8 Mauser. That was the cartridge that they were using at the time. And it's basically, this is the great-grandfather of the FN-FAL. It's an FN-FAL with a shorter magazine and with wood furniture. And it's a really nice gun. Well, Nasser took those because that's what the army was equipped with and went along for a while, but he decided, this is not good enough. What we really need is a domestic production of guns of some kind. We need a factory to make our own guns locally. So he looked around Europe for somebody and he says, hey, Britain, France, Czechs, anybody, can you come over, bring some engineers and bring some tooling and stuff and set up a factory for me? And everybody said, nah, except the Swedes. The Swedes said, sure. And they sent over a bunch of guys, and they sent over the magical rifle that they had developed by a guy named Eric Eklund, which is called the Hakim. And this is a Hakim. Ooh. The Hakim was basically, it's also an 8 Mauser, but it's a totally different system. This is the original direct gas impingement system. And it's a fascinating, fascinating rifle. It's like an AG-42 Jungmann, only with a few of the quirks of that one taken out of it. It's got quirks of its own, but for instance, it has a gas regulation system up here because, unlike Sweden, Egypt has dust storms, sandstorms, other weather-related issues that the Swedes never had to run into. So anyway, this is what they use. Well, about the time that this started happening, it was about 50, No, that'd be about 1953 or so. They were making these. And Nasser had this idea. He wanted to build a dam across the Nile, the Aswan High Dam. And he went to America because he was in the Western camp and said, America, bring some engineers over here and show me how to build a dam right here. And the engineers got all huffy and bureaucratic like Americans and said, well, have you made an environmental impact statement? What about relocation of people whose properties you're confiscating for this big lake? And what about and all the other things? They wanted all this paperwork. Nasser got ticked off and kicked him out. And because of that, he went around and asked anybody else. And he found the Russians. And he said, hey, USSR. And they said, comrade, come on into our camp. So he said, well, can you send me some engineers that'll build a dam? And they did. They sent engineers over. And they started work on the Aswan High Dam, which until recently was the largest dam on Earth. Now it's the Three Rivers Gorge Dam in China. Anyway, when he moved over there, they said, well, by the way, as long as you're coming over here to our side, why don't you change all your ordnance over to this new 7.62 by 39 cartridge, which is much shorter than 8 Mauser. Well, his people thought that was a pretty damn good idea. And they said, no, hey, great. In that case, why don't we send you some tooling for the SKS? They'd made the SKS. They'd already changed to the AK, but they wanted to sell off this SKS stuff to anybody they could unload it on. Anyway, so Egypt said, no thanks. And in the interim, Czechoslovakia sold them a bunch of these. This is a VZ52. It's also an intermediate cartridge. It's 7.62 by 41. Czechs have to be different in everything. It works very similar to the SKS and even has a swinging out bayonet, only in this case it's flat to the side instead of underneath like the SKS. And they had a bunch of these for a while. Incidentally, the other main user of this particular gun when the Czechs no longer had it was the CIA. They equipped all the Bay of Pigs guys with those. Well, at that time, the Russians had decided that their satellite state of the Czechoslovakia should not be doing this. They should go over and use a regular AK-47. So the Czechs developed their own, and that's another story. But Egypt was just a client state, not a satellite. And they took the whole concept, oh, wait a minute, not this one. This one. They took the concept of the SKS and the tooling for the yeoman and came out with this. That is a Rashid. It's basically a shortened Hakim or AG-42 with some improvements. They've got an actual bolt handle on this one. It has its own swing-out bayonet, just like an SKS. Matter of fact, the cuts in the wood here look like an SKS. I don't have the magazine in it. It's sitting over there. Yeah, sitting over there. But lovely, isn't it? I mean, this is probably the best-looking SKS you'll find. I mean, Hakim you'll find out there in the surplus world. I've seen lots of these that look really, really trash. Same with this Hakim. I've worked on these two and changed got their finish in much better shape. Well, these all were built, the Hakim and the Rashid, in the Mahdi factory, which was set up in the Helwan district of Cairo. And by the way, they also did a contract on the Beretta 1951 and made the Helwan pistol there. I've got one over there on the wall. But this is about rifles. So here, Egypt has gone through many, many rifles. By this time, Russia really was looking for some funds, and they said we can send over some tooling and engineers and the data package for the AK-47. And they said, sounds good. Set it up over here in the Mahdi factory, and that's the AK-47 made in Egypt is called the Mahdi because of that. But anyway, these two and that AK-47, which I don't have, are the standard Egyptian rifles. I think they still have some Hakims as substitute standards put away. They only made about 4,000 of these, and I have read, no, I've seen a statement that 8,000 were made. I don't believe that. I think about 4,000 were made. And I think somewhere around 500 to 1,000 of these actually got imported into the U.S. There's one of the rarer Army surplus guns you can find out there, or milsurps. And this one, I think, looks really gorgeous. And for both my Hakim and my Rashid, I have 2 magazines each, which is kind of unique because they should be just 1 magazine that came with them. And a lot of the ones that International Military Arms, basically, or Tiger Arms, or whatever they're called this week, that they have, that came from various Ethiopian and other stores. They're just wrecked, and most are missing their magazines. So somebody would love to talk to me because if they've got a Hakim and don't have a magazine, because I've got a spare. I had a spare for the Rashid here too. I saw them both at various gun stores in bins of magazines that I don't know what the hell they are, and $5 each. So I looked around, and I know what magazines look like. I got a 1907 Savage magazine in such a deal in a store once. Anyway, this is the tale of the evolution of the Egyptian rifle, battle rifle, from the early 19th century, when they started out using those, like the ones the Afghans had, you know, the curved flintlocks, or firelocks even, I think they still had, up through the rolling block to these. And now Egypt is on the AK-47, and these end up as military surplus here in the U.S., which I don't mind because I collect it, and I love it. Anyway, if you like this kind of stuff, let me know in the comments, and tell me what you think. Like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff too. Happy trails.